Well, we've got you today to talk about Jedi Knights, Mystic Saints, and the spiritual journey that creates heroes. Like you always come up with these fantastic little packages. And then we'll go 15 minutes later, we'll talk about storytelling being essential for our spiritual lives. So I think this will be a pretty fun sort of back to back. We get to kind of relax and chill into a brainy space after
I
all of
hope
the
so.
nerdery. So
I
first
hope
of
so. I
all,
know people are gonna have a lot of me now, so hopefully that'll be good for them.
well, there you go. Friends, you can say hi in the comments. You've got questions. We're talking about Star Wars, and we've got Eric Clayton. I just had him on the channel. We talked about his recent book. Actually, no, it was last year, right? My Life with the Jedi.
My life with the Jedi. Yes, my life with the Jedi. It's always nearby in case people need to see it. Although it might be backwards. I can't ever really know how
No,
the chat
you're good. I see it
reveals
the
it. All
right
right,
way. Yep.
there we
Your
go.
Life with Star Wars.
Yeah, yeah, man. So where do you want me to
First
begin?
of all, for those who have never heard of the book, give us a quick overview of the book, and then I want to hear briefly your origin story, and then we'll get into the topic. So, what's the book
Yeah.
about?
So the book is my attempt to reflect on Star Wars as a spiritual journey. And I work for the Jesuit conference. My Ignatian spirituality is my bread and butter. And so I'm always thinking about how do we find God in all things? How is God speaking through the stories of our days? And what does that demand of us? And so I know I love Star Wars. And so I kind of just dove deep into Star Wars to think about how these different spiritualities might better inform our lives. So it's a book that kind of takes you through a lot of different, not just the three trilogies, not even just the movies and the TV shows, but books, video games. I dive real deep into the nerddom of Star Wars and mine it for what can this reveal about our faith? And like I think I said when we were talking just the other week, it's not just like, all right, well, where's Jesus in this story? And those are good questions, but it's really how can we pray with this stuff? What happens when we enter the dark side cave? What happens when we are forced to discern between two spirits, which is the whole backbone of Ignatian spirituality. So it's a lot of fun. It's a fun book. I love talking about it. And I love always, every new Star Wars thing that comes out, I'm always thinking about it through the lens of Ignatian spirituality, which is all about discerning between light and dark.
Yeah. Oh, that's so fun. I remember somebody once saying, it was probably a teacher in college who's talking about in the seminary, anytime a teacher asks you a question on a test, whatever the question is, you can always say Jesus is the answer. And then the
Right.
teacher will always go, okay, yes, that's true, but under what mode, under what aspect? And so, like
It's like a
what you're
yes and.
saying,
It's like an improv thing. Well, yes and Jesus.
and what is the specific way in which Jesus is operating in this time and place and to this attitude and with these dynamics going on? So in the same way, like yourself, well, where's God in all this? It's like, well, no. God is the ground of being. It's like, of course, God's involved in everything. Now it's a matter of how much, in what way can we interpret, literally interpret the hell out of it to discern the God that's in it, right? So what's your background, or how did you get into Ignatian spirituality? Why is it such a big deal for you?
Yeah, so I went up, I grew up going to Catholic school, and then I went to a Jesuit college at Fairfield University, which is Jesuit Catholic school, but didn't really know anything about the Jesuits until I got there. And during those 4 years, very formative years, I had a spiritual director who was a Jesuit who really taught me about the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. And for folks who don't know, the spiritual exercises are all about discovering who God wants you to be. It's a vocational journey, but it's very much a hero's journey. You can look at, and like we can talk about this, in this section or the next. But it's very much you start in a status quo that's broken. You go on this transformative quest. Turns out, here's Jesus again. Jesus is the mentor figure, right, for the story. There's a dark night of the soul in the Passion, and then there's the resurrection where we have this return to community and a call to adventure again. So I love the spiritual exercises, and I love how Ignatian spirituality is always inviting us again to find God in unusual places, but to trust God at work there. So the Ignatian spirituality ended up being, again, very formative and foundational to how I understand God and the world and my place therein. And I worked at a Catholic Relief Services for a number of years, and then I started working at the Jesuit Conference about 6 or 7 years ago, which is basically the kind of the bureaucratic entity that connects the local Jesuit communities and works and apostolates to the Jesuits in Rome. So we're kind of a capacity building, liaisoning entity. But one of the things we do, and we can talk about this too, is the Jesuit Media Lab, which is this great opportunity for folks to it exists at the intersection of Ignatian spirituality and creativity. So I've been working in writing in this, and I'm a writer, so I have a bunch of books on Ignatian spirituality and everyday life. One of them happens to be about Star Wars, and yeah, I love it. I do a lot of writing, and it's a lot of fun.
That is awesome. I don't know, forgive me for asking this already. Are you working on a novel? Are you somebody who dabbles in fiction at all? I know you got
I
another
do,
book
yes,
coming
I
out.
am. I'm about 60,000 words into dabbling in fiction, so I got a good
Did I
sprint
ask you
here.
about that last time? I forgot.
I don't know, maybe, but
I don't think I
yeah,
did. I don't have you in that mental box in my brain. So what's your
I'm
novel
always
so far?
well, I'm always dabbling. I'm always. I also have like a nonfiction book always in the works, so it's always kind of competing. What's my? It's a. I have not nailed the elevator pitch yet for this book, but I'm calling it The Wild Parts: a love story. But it's about what happens when we are trying to love the parts of other people out of existence, and we're kind of like, oh, I wish you weren't like this, and I'm going to try really hard. So it's like relational, right? It's every kind of relationship. There's always those parts that we don't love about, or we struggle with in one another. But what happens if you can actually remove that? So there's some stuff in the world, right, where you have this kind of suppressing of parts of your mind, or it's severance kind of gives us an example of that. I'm kind of playing with it in kind of a quasi spiritual sci-fi adventure thing. So as you can tell, I've not nailed the elevator pitch, but I do have probably about 15,000 words left to write, and then I'm hoping to go back through and really understand what it's about. But
That's
yeah,
awesome.
it's exciting. And I have this,
Amazing.
as I told you, I have this Praying with Fairy Tales book coming out in October, and another book in the works for
By
after
the way,
that.
chat,
So
did you just catch that? He said praying with fairy tales. That just sounds like I can't wait to hear
yeah,
where this goes. It sounds amazing.
yeah. I think I could drop. I actually think I could drop, if people are interested, the link into the chat. If that's, I don't know if
Cool.
will that
That'll
break
be
any
my first
rules
time seeing it as
if
well.
I
Yeah.
do that? There you go. It's called Where Wonder Leads. Where Wonder Leads: Finding God Through Fairy Tales, Myth, and Contemplative Prayer. It's meant to be a spiritual adventure.
Wow.
But anyway,
Wow. That looks incredible. Man, that seems like a beautiful, like you and I were just chatting about Martin Shaw and Liturgy of the Wild last time. This seems like a beautiful follow up to that.
yeah, I do pull a lot from Martin Shaw. Being to be honest, in it, because I was reading his book as I was finishing, like, the penultimate draft of this one. I was like, oh, I got to get some of that in there because his stuff is so good, so smart. But
That's awesome. That's
yeah,
fantastic. I wanted to ask you something about oh, yes, talk about the Jesuit Media Lab, right? You recently put on this fantastic event, Faith That Builds Worlds, which I totally stole and then tagged on to the end. Ours is a faith that builds worlds without end. So I'm just going to
nice.
keep running with that. But talk about this Media Lab. What is it that it does, and why should people pay attention or get involved?
Yeah, I can drop a link to that into the chat too if you want. I don't know if I don't know how these links are working here, but
Yeah, they're good.
Jesuit Media Lab we exist to gather, form, and unleash creatives that are informed by the Ignatian tradition in some way. And we talk about Ignatian storytelling, or our kind of vocation to be Ignatian storytellers, kind of built on these four different pillars, right? Ignatian spirituality, as I said, sees God in all things. So anything is material for a story that's struck through by the divine and can be illuminative of how God is at work in our lives. Discernment is really key in Ignatian spirituality. And so we invite people to really discern, well, what are the stories that need to be told now? What are the stories that you can uniquely tell? What is God inviting you to do in your storytelling? Not unlike what you're doing here with LegendFiction, right? The imagination is central in Ignatian spirituality. The foundational story of St. Ignatius of Loyola, God speaks to him through his imagination. He's in bed. I don't want to bore people with the full Ignatian story here, but crucial to his life is this war wound, right? He's struck down in battle. He's forced to go back and recover in his home, and he spends 11 months in this imaginative prayer space. He wants to go back to being to waging wars and wooing women, as I like to say it. And but when he does that, he's feeling very desolate and dry. God works in his imagination and says, well, what if you became a saint? What if you became a mystic? What if you lived a life like St. Francis or like
I
St.
think part
Dominic?
of this story too, right, is his own sort of inner grit, right? Doesn't he have his leg rebroken 2 or 3 times without anesthetic
Yes.
because he wants to get back out there? And then when that's totally taken away, he's then offered this path that you're now talking about.
Yeah.
And he channels all that same strength into that.
That's crucial to the story, and actually we could talk about that with Star Wars too. But this idea of he couldn't bear the idea of being in court and having such an unsightly limp, right? His pride, the role of pride is really foundational in his story, and how his pride is what put him in front of the cannonball and got all of his fellow soldiers killed. His pride is what tells him he has to keep breaking his leg because he has to look the part, and ultimately he steps into the unknown, allowing God to work. Well, in his imagination, I can't even imagine what life might be if I don't go back there, but I'm going to trust in a God who is calling me that way anyway. And the imagination is central in Ignatian prayer because we're called to imagine ourselves in the scene, which is what I'm doing in that fairy tales book, not just in scripture, but in the stories of our day. And then finally, Ignatian spirituality invites us to pursue reconciliation. The literal mission statement of the Jesuit order is to reconcile the world to God and to one another. right? So that's how we think about stories in the Ignatian, in the Jesuit Media Lab, in the Ignatian tradition. And we invite people to submit to us. We platform authors. We give people a chance to write. They can write reflections on improv. They can write reviews of films. They can write book reviews, whatever. We have a bunch of courses and book clubs, and we're starting these new writing groups and a bunch of different activities where people can come together to be formed in the Ignatian tradition, to find community. And then we connect people, right, with other places. We have a lot of publishers in our circles. We have a lot of magazine editors, literary agents, all sorts of interesting people. Again, a lot of it similar to what you're doing here. And so it's a great place if folks are interested in, if folks are informed by or excited about the Ignatian spiritual tradition. I'd invite folks to get involved. You can contact me. We're doing a lot of really, really cool and fun stuff. And, throughout time, right, Jesuits have done a lot in the arts. Like you find a lot of Jesuits in theater, in visual arts, writing novels. And Jesuits are often characters in stories, both for good and for ill. So it's there's something in the tradition that really lends itself to that Catholic imagination.
That's fantastic. Okay, too many questions. Two that I want to ask. Okay, one I want to go back to. So you mentioned your novel. Have you? Is this the first one that you've crafted? Have you ever messed around with novel sort of fiction telling as opposed to the nonfiction, or is this your first foray into that?
Now, I've been messing around with fiction since I was in high school. So I mean, we're talking 15, 20 years. Well, how old am I? Maybe more than that, actually. But and I've gotten a few short stories published in places, which has been a lot of fun.
Nice.
And but it's hard. I think one of my great challenges, and I'm sure this is not uncommon for writers, is getting to the finish line. It's what I think about. And this is, again, I think we've talked about this before, Dominic, but the idea of the spiritual life is so interwoven in how we tell our stories and how we do our writing, right? So I'm always forced, I'm always judging myself. I'm always thinking, oh, like this isn't good enough. This isn't, this can't get published. No one wants to read this. These words stupid. Like, why are you can't even, like, do you even own a thesaurus, right?
Chat, type a 1 if this makes any sense to you. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Right. But it's so funny because that's so I mean, that's the evil spirit, right? Again, in Ignatian parlance, we would Saint Ignatius says the enemy of our human nature, right? That's what he talks about. That's how he names Satan or the devil, right? The enemy of our human nature. And so, what is that voice that is keeping us from flourishing? And I think about the Artist's Way. If you've done the Artist's Way, Julia Cameron's workshop,
No, I
but
haven't.
she talks
What
about
is
the censor. Oh no! Here, hang on. I'll hold the book up so folks can look. This is a great
Nice.
workshop. We actually just did one of these, facilitated a group for the Jesuit Media Lab. It's very fun, but she talks about the censor as this voice that tells you you're not good enough. And so that voice is always in my ear. I'm always comparing, my first draft to everyone's finished novels, which I know you're not supposed to do, of course, Rule 101 there. But if you think of it in the spiritual way, right? Hey, that's the enemy of our human nature trying to insist that my writing isn't good enough, that I shouldn't push through because why should I even show up, And I think that's when we add that layer of spirituality, because again, I know you talk about this, right, as vocational. This work is vocational. God is here in this work. And so anything that's keeping us from that, doing the work of creation, which, because we're made in the image and likeness of a creator, is the voice of the evil spirit. And so, I don't know. Does that help me write more? I don't know, but it definitely helps me to add, I think, important stakes to the process. So I think, yeah, to answer your original question, I have dabbled a lot. I have a whole bunch of short stories and some novels of varying degrees of completion in my file, but this is the latest, and again, we're about 60,000 words, so I'm feeling good about getting to a finish line. And I'd love to get to the finish line before I have to start working on the next book I'm working on, spiritual nonfiction, so I can put it aside and then come back to it. So.
Well, kudos on the word count. Somebody in chat just said kudos on the word count. By the way, for the heck of shouting it out, we're hosting a 30-day writing challenge. Started yesterday. So the goal is 30 days to 30K. So we're trying to write 1,000 words a day or whatever you want or can. And we do it together as a group. So, hey, you're welcome to join if you want to get that in. What kinds of stories do you like or have you liked to write? And what kind of fiction do you like to create?
Speculative of all sorts. I feel like I usually lean towards, or I've historically leaned into space fantasy, like Star Wars, because I love Star Wars, space opera-y stuff. But I'm more and more intrigued with the idea of just speculative fiction in general. And so stories that feel like they could be happening down the road, and then suddenly there's an interruption of magic or wonder or otherworldly nonsense. And I really like that because it kind of feels a little creepy, there's a little spookiness to it, but it also, I think, speaks to this Catholic imagination that says, hey, like that's actually the real world. We're living in a world where God interrupts whenever God desires to interrupt, and you best be on the lookout. So yeah, so I do. Yeah, I've done high fantasy, I've done science fiction, I've done more space fantasy.
Nice.
And the one I'm working on now is, I would just broadly say, speculative fiction. There's not a lot of science happening in it, but it definitely has a fantastical world nature to it and pseudoscience stuff happening in the second act.
Man, this is so cool. This is parts of you that I didn't know yet. So that's fun.
There you go, man.
Let's go back and talk about Jedi saints. Then I want to ask you about fairy tales again. But if you were to make a list of the most Jedi-like saints, and then if you had a favorite, who are they and what would that be?
Oh, man, a list. I didn't do my homework for this.
Okay,
I mean,
maybe,
I always
maybe
start.
one or two then.
Well, I always start with Ignatius, right? I always start with Ignatius of Loyola because he has so much of that kind of, he was a knight or akin to a knight, but the spiritual life is what he ultimately had to sink into, and I think there's a lot of good.
Is he
Star
similar
Wars
to any
stuff.
Star Wars figure? Like you would match him up with anybody? Is he like a Qui-Gon?
I wouldn't compare him to a Qui-Gon. Let me think. I'll tell you this. I'll answer your question from a different path. I was on a podcast several months ago, and the hosts stop me if I've already told you this story. But the host said to me, who from Star Wars world would you elect Pope?
Oh, that's
I
fun.
thought this already. Did we talk about this?
No, you didn't. Go ahead.
And I said Qui-Gon Jinn, obviously, and they were shocked. I said, well, why? I said, because Qui-Gon Jinn is of the people, right? He wants to, he's engaged with the living force as well as the cosmic force. He passionately loves the institution of the Jedi Order, but he also knows that it needs to be closer to the people, and there are flaws that need to be addressed. And so he was very, Qui-Gon was ahead of his time, and so I always thought of, in some ways, Pope Francis akin to Qui-Gon Jinn, who the Pope was when I was asked that question. And so, again, Pope Francis is not a saint, and Qui-Gon Jinn is not a pope. But I think that those qualities are really helpful. What other saints? I don't know. How about you? What do you think? I bet you have somebody in mind.
Oh, I have no idea. It's interesting to sort of chew around that. I mean, I sort of get, is it Saint Martin who cuts his cloak in half? I don't know why, but for some reason that just feels Jedi-like to me, but I need to think about that some more.
We could maybe cast Joan of Arc against the Clone Wars, right? Because you have a very right, because you have a very specific conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And a very specific task, and Joan of Arc is ultimately betrayed, much in the way the Jedi are, right? And
that's awesome. Yeah, that's true.
And so I think there's something to her story arc that could be.
Who does come to mind? I can't shake his story, so I don't know if you can. Maybe you can sort of see it with my camera. Whatever. I wrote a book called Hero Theory. It's for my day job, and I took a bunch of different saints and figures from history, and I went and sort of restudied them because I wanted to write kind of a short story version of their life that tried to capture the heroism sort of inherent in their story, and not just because they were holy, and then try to find like what is a lesson that could be applied for young men. And there's the one story that I did not expect to hit really hard and be really interesting was Saint Sebastian, and he feels sort of very Jedi-like because he was effectively not a tribune, Praetorian. He was a Praetorian guard tasked with protecting the emperor. And so we're talking SWAT level elite of the elites that are the bodyguards to the emperor. The problem is the emperors have to keep them very nicely pacified because if anything goes wrong, they will execute the emperor. And they had a history of and so when the emperor learns that Sebastian, as a Praetorian guard, is starting to convert other Praetorians to Christianity, that's like, person of interest, enemy number one in the Citadel. And so he condemns him to be executed. And what fascinates me is the fact that these Praetorians, his brothers, they all go to shoot him while he's, stripped and tied to something. And he survives. They leave him to die. That tells me one of two things. They're either really bad shots or they shot to miss. They're not bad shots. I think they didn't really want him to die or they felt bad, or I have no idea. Whatever is, the point is he survives, he's healed. And as soon as he's healed, he's given a choice. Well, I can either go and disappear or I can go back and stick it to the emperor. And so what does he do? He goes back and sort of, I'm assuming a garbled voice because an arrow through it. There's always an arrow through his throat. I can't imagine what his voice is like. And he meets the emperor coming down the steps of the Palatine Hill, whatever it is, and he challenges him to his face. Like he's like, where am I going to hide in this world? I'll be discovered or whatever. And at that point, the emperor's like, oh my gosh, this guy came back from the dead. Obviously, because there's no way my Praetorians would miss. Would you? And so it's like they pile on top of him, kill him, beat him with clubs to a pulp. So there's nothing that can come back and then flush him down the Cloaca Maxima. And then whatever's left of him is actually then gathered and then buried by another lady who helps him. Just that right there. Like I'd never heard of his story in those terms before. That feels very Jedi-like to me, I think.
Yeah, that kind of return. Well, I mean, how many Jedi seem to have survived Order 66? I feel like every new entry into the franchise, we have a new 6 Jedi. I feel like Order 66 at this point was a failure because of how many Jedi survived. But like, yeah, that That's thrust of a story where how do we they're coming back and do they fight? Like again, you look at the Obi-Wan Kenobi show and he didn't go stick it to the Empire. He went and he literally buried his lightsaber in the sand, as opposed to those who did try to stick it to the Empire and seem to have been cut down as a result. The other thing that came to mind, I was looking up his name, Saint Charbel of Lebanon, and
Interesting.
because I
Why?
think, and I'm not a scholar of these saints, but I believe he was just kind of a monk. But then after he died, I think there's some lights or something that was emanating from where he lived. And so this idea that it's not until after the character's dead that something, holy and spiritual seeps into the world. And that feels a little like Yoda in some ways, like a little like some of these Jedi that it's after they're gone that they come back and they're influencing events. So
That's so cool. I think I remember reading that in the different traditions, in the Western tradition, we have a much greater focus on the sort of passion of the saints and the sufferings that they endure, which end up being like incredible and like stigmata and whatever. And then over on the Eastern side, it's more, there's a theme of light where they seem to all be glowing all over the place, like lanterns going off, and it's just epic.
very mystical.
Goodness, okay. I'll say it out now before I forget. I want to have you back on the channel because I want to talk about the Sith and the Jedi, because I did not realize that the Sith never have Force ghosts, or if they do, I've not seen that. But they face, what is it? The open wound terror of the chaos or something. And I was then mulling over the noble anti-hero nature of the Sith. And so I want to come back and chat with you about that. You'll probably go really interesting places with that.
Let's talk about Maul. I mean, like, next week do that because I love the show Maul, and I love how I'm rooting for who's probably one of the best villains in all of Star Wars. But you're like, yeah, I want this guy to have some sort of justice,
So
even though like his justice is he's such a great anti-hero because he's a tragic character. Like his community has betrayed him, as opposed to a hero that the community is what you're fighting for. So, yeah.
Okay, well, that's okay. We don't have time to get into that topic because that's a whole rabbit hole. But last couple of minutes here, I did want to pick your brain a little bit or talk about why is storytelling essential for our spiritual lives?
I mean, it's how we make sense of God. There's a great Canadian Jesuit, John English. He's since deceased, but he says something to the effect of, we can pray with our graced history, which is how his term for kind of that prayerful review of our full, who we've been, where we are coming from, in the same way we prayed it with Scripture, right? That our story is just as important to understanding God at work as our holiest of texts. And I think that's very profound. Because I think we approach Scripture, right, with a certain level of reverence and an expectation to find God therein. Do we do the same thing with our own stories, right? Do we look at our own lives, and do we look at the things that we produce with such reverence, right? Because again, it's all of God. We're all made of that God stuff, right? And so understanding who we are, right, our own personal stories, our own vocations, again, very foundational to the spiritual life, but I think Ignatian spirituality has a particular way in there. But then thinking about the stories that the storyteller is telling, I think is it's profound spiritual questions. And these things are bound up in who we are and our deepest desires, and how those deepest desires quite literally appear on the page. We got to pay attention to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's so true. And I'm pretty sure I'm paraphrasing Martin Shaw badly, but I think he's got a quote that's like, stories are how our souls survive.
Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely true. What do you think about that? What goes through your mind?
I mean, how does it not? Like, it's just funny because it feels to me like storytelling in some ways is very trendy the last couple of years, and when I wrote my first book, Cannonball Moments, which is all about storytelling and Ignatian spirituality, it felt like I was trying to get in on this trend. At the same time, you're like, but how storytelling is always important because it's how we record our experiences, it's how we kind of bring our own lives into dialogue with the lives of others. It's how we understand where a person has come from. And I think one of the great harms of this moment, right, particularly with the kind of fracturing of people's lives across social media and this idea that we can know everything about a person, we're kind of collapsing people's stories. We're making people's stories very flat. And then when we're saying people's stories, I mean people's lives. And how can we kind of get a full 360 view of a person? And that might mean we can't know everything about everybody, but we have to recognize that we can't know everything about everybody. We're knowing just certain parts, and the people that are dearest to us, we want to dive deep and know who they are, because that's a sacred text. A person's life is a sacred text, and God is necessarily speaking through those, through His beloved people, right?
I love that. What a beautiful line. Everybody's life is a sacred text.
Put it on a t-shirt,
Eric. Yeah, put on a t-shirt. Where can people find you, Eric, online to get copies of your books? Man, I didn't even get to ask you about fairy tales. That is probably providential because I would probably want to keep going.
You can.
I have to ask. Favorite fairy tale.
Favorite fairy tale. Oh man, well, I do not have a good answer for that one. I just Little Mermaid's coming to mind because I like the classic one where she like has this tragic ending, right, from Hans Christian Andersen, and she doesn't find love and she fractures into a million little pieces. Like how tragic and sad. But that desire to have tried to love anyway. I don't know. That just comes to mind out of the gate. I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's haunting. And some of these,
Yes.
I think haunting is not a bad thing because it literally sticks with you, right? People can find me there, ericclaytonwrites.com. And my Star Wars book is, let me see if I can drop a link in there too. You can get it in time for Star Wars Day, which I know is everyone's biggest concern. So there it is. Bam.
Fantastic. So friends, you can head over to ericclaytonwrites.com and you can hit the link in the chat for, My Life with the Jedi. Eric, this was really fun. Thanks for jumping on.
Dominic, always a pleasure.